My partner called the police to have me removed from our home, claiming I was a threat during an argument. He thought he had won, but as I sat in my friend's car, I opened our smart home app and found the one thing he'd forgot: the audio history that recorded his entire conspiracy. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The flashing red and blue lights painted our serene suburban street in strokes of panic and shame. They pulsed across the living room walls, catching the silver frames of photos that told the story of a life I thought was ours. One of them, a picture from our trip to Italy 5 years ago, showed me and Leo, his arm wrapped tightly around my shoulders, both of us beaming under the Tuscan sun. Now that same man stood on our manicured lawn, his face a mask of strained sincerity as he spoke to two police officers. And I, the other half of that smiling picture, was the reason they were here. The argument had started, as they often did, over something small: a credit card bill, a detail he'd forgotten to mention about a recent business trip. I was a UX designer. My entire career was built on noticing details, on seeing how small, seemingly insignificant elements fit into a larger, more complex system. It was a skill that made me excellent at my job and increasingly miserable in my relationship. With Leo, the system was broken. The details never added up. "I just don't understand, Leo," I had said, my voice calmer than I felt. "This charge is for a hotel in the city. You told me you were staying with your cousin." His response was a wave of dismissive anger. "Are we really doing this again, Megan? You're going to interrogate me over $100 charge? I needed a quiet place to work. My cousin's kids were running wild." "You could have just told me that," I said, my voice rising slightly. "Why lie?" That was the word that ignited the fire. "Lie," he boomed, his posture shifting from defensive to aggressive. "You're accusing me of lying? After everything I do for us. I work myself to the bone, and all you do is pick and poke and look for reasons to start a fight." The argument spiraled from there, his voice growing louder, his gestures more expansive. He paced the room like a caged animal, knocking a stack of magazines from the coffee table. I stood my ground, my arms crossed, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I wasn't yelling. I wasn't threatening. I was simply refusing to back down, refusing to accept the gaslighting that had become the soundtrack to our lives. I was tired. Not just tired of the arguments, but a deep, bone-weary exhaustion from the emotional labor of loving a man who seemed to resent me for it. It was when I finally said, "I think you need to leave for the night, Leo. We can't talk like this," that his entire demeanor changed. The rage vanished, replaced by a chilling, almost theatrical calm. "You want me to leave?" he asked, his voice low. "You want me to leave my own house?" "It's my house too," I reminded him, my voice trembling slightly. "And right now, I don't feel safe with your anger." He stared at me for a long moment, a strange, calculating look in his eyes. "You don't feel safe?" he repeated slowly. Okay, I see." He pulled out his phone. My stomach plummeted. I thought he was calling his friend Mark to come and get him. I never, in a million years, could have predicted what he actually did. "Yes, I'd like to report a domestic disturbance," he said into the phone, his eyes locked on mine. His voice was steady, laced with a convincing tremor of fear. "My partner, Megan, she's out of control. I'm worried she's going to hurt herself or me. She's throwing things. I feel threatened." The world tilted on its axis. Every word was a lie, a grotesque distortion of the reality I was living. I hadn't thrown a thing. My voice was the one that had remained steady. He was the one who had been roaring. But as I stood there, frozen in disbelief, I saw the checkmate he was playing. He was a tall, imposing man. I was a petite woman. He was calm and articulate. I was visibly shaking, my face pale with shock. He was painting a picture for an audience that wasn't there yet, and he knew exactly how it would look when they arrived. When the officers came to the door, he met them outside, the perfect image of a distraught but composed victim. They listened to him, their faces professional but sympathetic. Then they approached me. I tried to explain, to tell them what really happened, but my words felt flimsy and panicked against the solid, pre-constructed narrative Leo had built. "Ma'am, for everyone's safety, we feel it's best if you leave the premises for the night," one of the officers said, not unkindly. "Do you have a friend or family member you can stay with?" Humiliation washed over me in a hot, sickening wave. I was being evicted from my own life, based on a complete fabrication. Leo stood behind the officer, his expression a careful blend of sorrow and relief. He had won. He had used the most extreme tool imaginable to end an argument, and it had worked perfectly. I nodded mutely, my throat too tight to speak. My mind raced, trying to find a foothold in the crumbling landscape of my reality. The only person I could think of was Jenna. The betrayal was a physical thing, a cold, heavy weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. It was worse than any argument, any lie he had ever told. It was a fundamental rewriting of our history, of my character, for his own convenience. The click of the car door shutting felt like a final, damning gavel. I sank into the passenger seat of Jenna's beat-up sedan, the worn fabric a small, rough comfort against my trembling hands. The flashing police lights receded in the rearview mirror, shrinking until they were just malevolent red and blue specks against the dark canvas of my neighborhood. My home. A place that just an hour ago had been my sanctuary. Now it was a crime scene, and I was the alleged perpetrator. Jenna didn't speak. She just reached over and squeezed my hand, her touch a grounding anchor in the dizzying storm of my emotions. Tears I hadn't even realized were welling up finally spilled over, tracing hot, silent paths down my cold cheeks. I stared out the window at the familiar houses passing by, their windows glowing with the warm light of ordinary, peaceful evenings. It felt like watching a movie of a life that was no longer mine. "He called the police, Jenna," I whispered, the words tasting like poison. "He told them I was a threat. He lied." "I know, Meg," she said, her voice filled with a quiet fury that was more comforting than any platitude. "He's a monster. We always knew something was off, but this is a whole other level of evil." She was right. For years, there had been small signs, little red flags I had rationalized or ignored. His charm that could turn off like a switch. The way he subtly isolated me from friends he deemed a bad influence. The financial inconsistencies I was always too tired to untangle. I had mistaken his control for protectiveness, his moodiness for the stress of his work as a freelance consultant. I had built an entire reality on a foundation of carefully curated excuses. Now, he had taken a sledgehammer to the whole facade. My phone buzzed in my lap. It was Leo. My thumb hovered over the screen, a nauseous mix of dread and a foolish, lingering hope filling my chest. Maybe he was remorseful. Maybe it was a text of apology, a desperate plea to fix the terrible mistake he'd made. I opened it. "The police said you have to stay away for 24 hours. I've packed a bag for you with some essentials. I'll leave it on the porch. Please don't make this any harder than it has to be." No apology, no remorse, just cold, clinical instructions. He was treating this like an administrative task, a neat and tidy solution to an inconvenient problem, me. The cruelty of it stole my breath. He'd packed a bag, as if I were a difficult guest being politely shown the door, not the woman who had shared his life for nearly a decade. He was consolidating his victory, tidying up the loose ends. "What did he say?" Jenna asked, glancing at my face. I couldn't answer. I just shook my head, the motion feeling heavy and slow. The image of him, calmly selecting a few of my things and placing them in a bag, played over and over in my mind. What had he chosen? My toothbrush, a change of clothes, the book on my nightstand? Each imagined item felt like a tiny, separate violation. He was curating the evidence of my banishment. We drove in silence for a few more minutes, the only sound the hum of the engine and my own ragged breathing. Jenna's apartment was a small, cluttered haven on the other side of town. As she pulled into her designated parking spot, I just sat there, staring at the glowing screen of my phone. My mind was a chaotic whirlwind of shock and pain, but beneath it, something else was beginning to stir. The part of me that was a designer, the part that analyzed systems and looked for patterns, was starting to wake up. Leo was methodical. He was a planner. He hadn't done this on a whim. That cold, calculating look in his eyes before he made the call, he had a goal. He wasn't just trying to win an argument, he was trying to remove me. The thought was chilling, but it was also clarifying. If this was a calculated move, he would have made preparations. He would have a story, a script. The phrase he used to the 911 operator. Out of control. It felt rehearsed. And then it hit me. A jolt of electricity shot through the fog of my despair. The smart home system. Leo had been obsessed with it, installing smart speakers, cameras, and sensors throughout our house. He loved the convenience, the ability to control everything with his voice. I had designed the user interface for a similar system at my last job, so I was intimately familiar with its features, including the ones most people overlooked. The audio history. The device was always listening for its wake word, and it often stored short recordings of ambient sound, conversations, and commands. My heart began to pound again, but this time it wasn't with fear. It was with a wild, desperate hope. Leo's voice on the phone with the police, his careful, measured tones. He had been standing right next to our smart speaker in the living room. It was possible, just barely possible, that the device had captured something. With trembling fingers, I navigated to the app on my phone. My thumbprint granted me access to the digital heart of our home. The dashboard glowed back at me. Lights on, thermostat set to a comfortable 70 degrees, front door locked. A perfect picture of domestic tranquility that belied the ugliness of the evening. I navigated to the settings, my breath catching in my throat. I found the activity log, then the voice history. My finger shook as I tapped it. A list of audio clips appeared, time-stamped. My eyes scanned down the list, my pulse roaring in my ears. There it was. A recording from 20 minutes ago, right after the police had arrived and I had walked out the door to wait for Jenna. And another one, just a few minutes after that. It wasn't the call to 911. It was something else. It was a recording of a new phone call Leo had made from inside the house. My mind was still reeling from the primary shock of his betrayal, the public humiliation. But as I looked at that timestamp, a new, colder realization began to form. He wasn't just an opportunist who had used a moment of anger to his advantage. This was something more. This was a plan. My training, my entire career, was about understanding user behavior, about predicting how someone would interact with a system to achieve a goal. And I knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, what Leo's goal was, but he had made a mistake. He, the master of control, had forgotten about the one system in the house that was always listening. He had forgotten one crucial thing. The house had been my project. When we first bought the place, a charming but neglected colonial on a tree-lined street, it was my down payment, inherited from my grandmother, that made it possible. Leo was in one of his transitional periods. Back then, between consulting gigs, his own finances a vague and turbulent sea I didn't dare to navigate. I didn't mind. I saw it as an investment in us, in the future I was so certain we would build together. I spent months pouring my heart and my savings into that house. I stripped wallpaper, sanded floors, and spent countless hours designing the perfect kitchen layout. I was a UX designer, obsessed with flow and functionality, and I wanted our home to be a seamless extension of our lives, effortless, intuitive, and beautiful. Leo was always supportive, but from a distance. He'd praise my color choices and compliment the new fixtures, but he rarely picked up a paintbrush or a hammer. His contribution was big picture, thinking, he'd say with a charming smile. "You're the artist, Meg. I'm just the lucky guy who gets to live in the masterpiece." I ate it up. I loved the idea of creating this perfect world for us. I saw my sacrifice not as a sacrifice, but as an act of love. When he landed a big contract a year later, he insisted on buying the smart home system. It was his way of contributing, of putting his own modern stamp on my traditional taste. "This is the future, baby," he'd said, installing smart speakers in every room. Total control, ultimate efficiency. At the time, I thought it was a sweet, if slightly nerdy, gesture. I never imagined he would one day use his efficient system to dismantle my life. Leo was the epitome of polished charisma. To our friends, he was the fun, successful guy, the one with the great stories, the expensive watch, and the confident laugh. He was a freelance business consultant, a title that sounded impressive but was intentionally vague. He helped streamline operations for startups. He'd explain at dinner parties, and people would nod, impressed. I, however, had seen the other side. I'd seen the frantic anxiety behind the confident facade, the weeks where no work came in, the way he'd pivot to a new, unbeatable business idea every 6 months. His interest in my finances had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. It started with casual questions about my salary, then my investment portfolio, then the details of the inheritance from my grandmother. He framed it as concern. "I just want to make sure you're protected, Meg, that we're protected." He'd talk about merging our finances, about putting his name on the deed to the house to make things simpler, legally. I always hesitated, a small, persistent voice of caution in the back of my mind. It was this hesitation, I now realized, that he had been working so hard to overcome. My independence was a bug in his system, a problem he needed to solve. The antagonist in this carefully constructed drama wasn't just Leo, it was the persona he had built. And his primary supporting actor was his friend Mark. Mark was Leo's oldest friend, a doughy, unremarkable man who worked in it and seemed to worship the ground Leo walked on. He was always there, a loyal sidekick laughing a little too loudly at Leo's jokes, nodding in agreement with his opinions. I had always found him a bit pathetic, but harmless. I was wrong. He wasn't harmless, he was an enabler. In the past, I'd overheard snippets of their conversations, with Leo complaining about my anxiety or my constant questioning. He would frame my reasonable concerns as emotional instability. "She's just so sensitive," he'd tell Mark with an exaggerated sigh, and Mark would nod sympathetically. "You have the patience of a saint, man." Leo wasn't just lying to me. He was building a long-term narrative for an audience, casting me as the difficult, unstable partner long before he ever picked up the phone to call the police. He was creating a chorus of sympathizers who would back him up. The last few months, his comments had become more pointed. He'd make jokes about the house. "Can you believe Megan still won't put my name on the title? You'd think she doesn't trust me," he said to a group of friends at a barbecue a few weeks ago, laughing as if it were the funniest thing in the world. I'd felt a hot flush of embarrassment, but forced a smile, not wanting to be the sensitive one who couldn't take a joke. I see now that it wasn't a joke. It was a public test, a way to gauge how much he could get away with, how far he could push the narrative of me being unreasonable. He was laying the groundwork, brick by insidious brick, for the night he would finally try to tear it all down. He wasn't just a man who had lost his temper. He was a predator who had been patiently stalking his prey, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And tonight, he thought he had. The stale air in Jenna's spare bedroom felt thick and suffocating. For hours, I had been cycling through waves of grief, anger, and a hollow, numbing shock. But staring at my phone screen at the list of audio files, I felt a new emotion crystallize within me: purpose. The victim inside me was starting to recede, replaced by the designer, the problem solver. My home had been turned into a weapon against me, but Leo, in his arrogance, had left behind the blueprints to his entire attack plan. My finger, still trembling slightly, pressed play on the first recording. It was time-stamped just minutes after I had left with Jenna. The audio was crystal clear. First, there was the sound of the front door closing, the lock clicking into place. Then, Leo's heavy sigh, a sound not of distress, but of profound relief. A few seconds of silence, then the distinct sound of him dialing his phone. "Mark, it's me," Leo's voice said, low and urgent. "It's done, she's gone." "Wow, you actually did it," Mark's voice crackled back, a note of awe in his tone. "The cops just left." "Yeah, about 5 minutes ago. It worked like a charm," Leo said, and I could hear the smirk in his voice. "They totally bought it. I gave them the whole 'I'm so scared, she's so unstable' routine. They looked at her, all pale and shaky, and they looked at me, Mr. Calm and concerned. It was perfect." My stomach churned. Hearing my own trauma described as a routine was sickening. "So, they're going to want a statement," Leo continued, his voice shifting into a more instructional, authoritative tone. They might call you, since I gave them your name as someone who has witnessed her outbursts. My name? Whoa, Leo, wait, Mark said, a flicker of panic in his voice. What do I say? I've never seen her have an outburst in my life. You will have now, Leo said coolly. Listen to me very carefully. This is what you're going to tell them. About a month ago at the barbecue, you remember when I made that joke about the house title? You're going to say that after everyone left, she went ballistic. Accused me of trying to steal her money. Threw a wine glass. Not at me, make sure you say not at me, just at the wall. You were on your way out and you heard it from the driveway. You were worried, but I smoothed it over. Got it. A cold dread washed over me. He was creating a history of violence, manufacturing a memory, and inserting his friend into it as a witness. It was diabolical. I guess, Mark stammered, through a wine glass. Yes, a wine glass. It's specific, it's believable, Leo coached, his patience wearing thin. And if they ask about tonight, you just say I called you, sounding terrified. Said Megan was screaming that you could hear things breaking eye. And the background, don't overdo it. Just sound worried for your buddy. The key is to make her sound unpredictable. Volatile, that's the word you use. Volatile, can you remember that? Volatile, yeah, okay. I can do that, Mark said, his voice gaining a sliver of confidence, the loyal soldier receiving his orders. Good, Leo finished. Because this is the first step. Once there's a police record of her instability, everything else gets easier. The house, everything. Just stick to the script, Mark. I'll make it worth your while. The recording ended. I felt like I was going to be sick. He had said it. Everything else gets easier. The house, everything. It was never about the argument. It was never about his fear. It was a cold, calculated real estate transaction, and I was just a difficult tenant he was trying to evict. My grief morphed into a hard, cold fury. He thought I was a fragile, emotional wreck he could easily dispose of. He had underestimated me. He had forgotten that I designed the systems he used, that I understood them better than he ever could. He had handed me the one thing that could destroy him, his own voice, narrating his own crime. My passive despair vanished, replaced by a steely resolve. This was no longer just a breakup, it was a battle, and I had just been handed the ultimate weapon. I didn't sleep. I spent the rest of the night in a state of hyper-focused activity. I forwarded the audio files to my personal email, to a cloud backup, and to Jenna's email, creating multiple redundancies. I transcribed the entire conversation, word for word, noting the timestamps. I went online and began researching lawyers, not just any divorce lawyer, but the best, most ruthless litigator I could find who specialized in high-conflict separations and asset protection. By dawn, I had a name. An older woman named Evelyn Reed, known for her meticulous preparation and for surgically dismantling manipulative spouses in court. Her website featured testimonials that read like war stories. She was exactly what I needed. At 8:01 a.m., I left a message with her office, my voice clear and steady. I didn't sound like a victim. I sounded like a client. My name is Megan, I said. I need to schedule an urgent consultation with Ms. Reed. I am in possession of incontrovertible evidence of conspiracy and fraud in a domestic dispute. The evidence is time-stamped and irrefutable. Hanging up the phone, I felt a sense of power I hadn't felt in years. Leo thought he had stripped me of my home and my dignity. He was wrong. He had just reminded me of who I was. A builder, a planner, a woman who understood exactly how systems work. And I was about to design one he would never see coming. Evelyn Reed was a force of nature. She was a woman in her late 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing and a hairstyle that looked like it hadn't changed since 1985 and didn't care. Her office was spare and modern, with none of the comforting clutter I expected. It felt like a command center, and she was its general. I sat across from her gleaming mahogany desk and told her everything, my voice even and my hands steady. I didn't cry. I presented the facts, the timeline of the argument, the arrival of the police, and Leo's chillingly instructional text message. Then I slid my phone across the desk. "This is the evidence," I said. Evelyn put on a pair of reading glasses, plugged in a set of headphones, and listened. I watched her face. It remained impassive, a blank mask of professionalism, but I saw a subtle tightening around her jaw as Leo's voice filled her ears, coaching Mark on how to lie. When the recording finished, she took off the headphones and looked at me. A slow, thin smile spread across her lips. It was the most terrifying and beautiful smile I had ever seen. "Well, Ms. Hale," she said, her voice a low purr. "Your partner isn't just a bully, he's a fool. An arrogant, sloppy fool. This recording isn't just a smoking gun, it's a signed, notarized confession delivered on a silver platter." A wave of relief so profound it almost made my knees weak washed over me. "So, it's enough." "Enough," Evelyn chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "Megan, with this, we don't just protect you, we control the narrative, we control the outcome. He wanted to play chess, but he showed you all his moves in advance. Our job now is to let him walk right into our trap." Her strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. We would not reveal the recording. Not yet. The 24-hour period Leo mentioned was a police suggestion, not a legal order. The first step was for me to legally regain access to my home. Evelyn drafted an emergency motion and a sternly worded letter to be delivered to Leo by a process server that afternoon. It stated that I, as a legal resident and cohabitant, would be returning to the residence to collect personal and professional belongings, and that any attempt to impede me would result in immediate legal act. "Ian, he will expect you to be scared and compliant," Evelyn explained. "He will not expect you to show up with a legal letter just hours later. It will rattle him, and when he's rattled, he'll make mistakes." That evening, I returned to the house. Jenna drove me, waiting in the car at the curb as my own personal getaway driver. Walking up the stone path to my front door felt surreal. The process server had already been there. A crisp white envelope was tucked into the mail slot. I took a deep breath, my heart hammering, and used my key. The lock turned. He hadn't changed it. That was his first mistake. I stepped inside. The house was quiet, filled with the faint, familiar scent of lemon cleaner and something else, Leo. He was sitting in the living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his face a thundercloud of fury. The legal letter was crumpled on the coffee table next to him. "What do you think you're doing?" he snarled, standing up. "The police said you had to stay away." I kept my voice calm, just as Evelyn had coached me. "The police made a suggestion, Leo. My lawyer clarified my legal right to be here. I'm just gathering some work things and personal items." The word lawyer hit him like a physical blow. I saw it register in his eyes, a flicker of shock, then anger, then a sliver of fear. This was not part of his plan. I was supposed to be hiding at a friend's house, crying and defeated. I was not supposed to have a lawyer. "A lawyer?" he scoffed, trying to regain his footing. "Isn't that a bit dramatic? We had a fight, Megan. You overreacted, I overreacted. That's all." "You called the police and lied to them, Leo. That's a bit more than an overreaction," I said, walking past him toward my home office. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to move with purpose. He followed me, his presence a heavy weight behind me. "I was scared. You were out of control," he insisted, his voice rising. "Mark can vouch for me. He knows how you get." This was it, the moment Evelyn had prepared me for. I stopped at the door to my office and turned to face him, my expression one of mild, curious confusion. "Mark," I asked, tilting my head slightly. "Why would Mark know anything about it? He wasn't here." Leo's face went pale. It was a subtle shift, but I saw it. I had just revealed a card he didn't know I was holding. He had told Mark to say he had heard me screaming over the phone when Leo called him. He hadn't told Mark to lie about being physically present, but in his agitated state, he had conflated the two lies. My simple, innocent question had exposed a crack in his story. I called him," Leo stammered, his eyes darting around nervously. "He heard you on the phone. He heard the whole thing." "He heard me on the phone with you?" I pressed, feigning innocence. "That's strange. I don't remember you being on the phone with anyone while we were arguing." Checkmate. The blood drained from his face. He had walked right into it. His fabricated timeline was unraveling with two simple questions. He had prepared Mark for a police interview, but he hadn't prepared himself for a cross-examination from me. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. The confident, manipulative man from last night was gone, replaced by a cornered animal. He didn't know what I knew, he just knew that I knew something, and the uncertainty was eating him alive. I didn't say another word. I just gave him a small, pitying smile, turned and walked into my office, closing the door softly behind me. I leaned against it, my body trembling with adrenaline. The first crack in his fortress had appeared, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the whole thing came crashing down. The next few days were a masterclass in psychological warfare, orchestrated by Evelyn Reed. Her advice was simple: stay in the house. "He wants you gone for a reason," she'd said. "Your presence is a constant, unnerving reminder that he has lost control. Let him simmer in it." Living under the same roof as Leo was one of the hardest things I've ever done. We were two ghosts haunting the same space, communicating only through terse, necessary exchanges. The air was thick with unspoken accusations and simmering rage. He watched my every move, his eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and fear. He was trying to figure out my angle, what I knew and how I knew it. He'd try to bait me into arguments, to provoke the volatile reaction he had described to the police, but I refused to engage. I was a gray rock, calm, polite, and unreadable. My placid demeanor seemed to unnerve him more than any outburst could have. Meanwhile, Evelyn was building our case with surgical precision. She had me methodically document everything. I used my UX skills to create a detailed timeline of our entire relationship, focusing on financial contributions. I pulled bank statements, receipts for home renovations, and copies of the wire transfers for the down payment. I was creating a data-driven story that proved the house was, in substance if not in shared title, built on my foundation. Evelyn also hired a forensic accountant. Men like Leo, who build their lives on lies, almost always have financial skeletons, she predicted. Let's go find them. She was right. The accountant's initial report was damning. Leo's successful consulting business was a house of cards. He had significant debt, a string of failed business ventures he'd hidden from me, and had been using his credit cards for lavish expenses while telling me money was tight. The hotel charge that had started the final argument wasn't just a lie about where he was staying. It was part of a pattern of financial infidelity. He was living a life I was unknowingly subsidizing. The house wasn't just an asset he wanted. It was a lifeboat he desperately needed. Armed with this new information, Evelyn advised the next move. It was time to show him another one of our cards. It happened on a Saturday morning. I was in the kitchen making coffee when Leo came in, his face etched with stress. He'd been on the phone all morning, his voice low and anxious. "We need to talk," he said, his tone attempting to be reasonable but failing. "This is ridiculous, Megan, us living like this. And you with a lawyer? It's insane. Let's just be adults about this. We can sell the house, split it 50-50, and walk away." There it was, the endgame. His whole charade, the police call, the lies, was a negotiation tactic to get a 50% share of a property he had barely contributed to. I took a slow sip of my coffee, my hand perfectly steady. "I don't think 50-50 is a fair reflection of our respective contributions to this asset, Leo," I said calmly, using the sterile, financial language Evelyn had taught me. His face hardened. "It's our home, we built a life here, don't be so cold and transactional." "You're the one who made it transactional, Leo," I replied, my voice still even. "Especially when you've been struggling so much with your business." His eyes widened in genuine shock. It was a direct hit. He had no idea I knew about his financial situation. "What are you talking about? My business is fine." "Is it?" I asked gently. I reached for my laptop on the counter, opened a file, and turned the screen towards him. It was the forensic accountant's preliminary report, a neat spreadsheet detailing his debts and liabilities. Because this data seems to tell a different story. The color drained from his face. He looked from the screen to me, his mouth agape. He was utterly exposed. This was more than just catching him in a lie. This was me revealing that I had unearthed the entire secret life he had so carefully constructed. How did you get this? He stammered, his voice barely a whisper. I have a very good lawyer, I said simply. He sank onto a kitchen stool, his bravado completely gone. He looked smaller, deflated. The charming consultant, the master manipulator, had vanished. In his place was just a desperate, frightened man. But then a cornered animal does one of two things. It either surrenders or it lashes out. Leo chose the latter. A flicker of his old anger returned. This is garbage. You're inventing things. Mark will tell them. He'll tell them how you are, how you twist things. He was still clinging to his one lifeline, his coached witness. It was time to cut it. Leo, I said, my voice dropping, becoming serious. You need to stop talking about Mark. You really do. I picked up my phone, which was sitting next to the laptop. I didn't unlock it. I just held it in my hand. Before you say his name one more time, I said, looking him directly in the eye, I want you to think very, very carefully. I want you to think about the phone call you made to him last Tuesday night, the one you made right after I left the house. His breath hitched, his eyes locked on my phone. The blood, which had drained from his face moments before, now seemed to vanish entirely. He understood. He didn't know how, but he knew that I knew. He knew that his conspiracy, his carefully whispered instructions to his friend, were no longer a secret. The silence in the room was absolute. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the wall. In that moment, the power dynamic in our relationship, which had been skewed in his favor for a decade, shifted completely and irrevocably. I held all the cards. He knew it, and I knew it. The only thing left was to play the final hand. The showdown was scheduled for the following Wednesday in Evelyn Reed's conference room. It was framed as a mediation session, a final attempt to resolve the division of assets before heading to court. Leo had agreed, likely seeing it as his last chance to negotiate a settlement before things got truly ugly. He had hired his own lawyer, a slick, overconfident man named Peterson who looked more like a real estate agent than a litigat. Or, what Leo didn't know was that Evelyn had sent a subpoena to Mark, requesting his presence as a potential witness. She had also, very deliberately, leaked a single, out-of-context sentence from the transcript to Peterson. I'll make it worth your while. She presented it as a potential bribery issue she was investigating. It was a calculated move to ensure Mark would show up, likely coached by Peterson to deny everything. I walked into the conference room feeling a strange sense of calm. The room was intimidating, with a long, polished table and a panoramic view of the city, but my fear was gone. It had been replaced by a cold, hard certainty. Megan the victim was a distant memory. Today, I was Megan the architect, and this room was the stage for the final user test of my new system. Leo and his lawyer were already there. Leo wouldn't meet my eyes. He sat slumped in his chair, looking pale and haggard. Mark was there too, sitting next to their lawyer, looking terrified. He fidgeted with his tie, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape route. Evelyn began the proceedings with a calm, professional overview of our positions. She laid out my financial contributions to the house, presenting the forensic accountant's report with detached precision. Peterson countered with bluster, talking about emotional equity and shared life contributions, and the emotional distress Leo had suffered due to my erratic behavior. And on the night in question, Peterson said, gesturing dramatically, my client was in genuine fear. A fear corroborated by Mr. Mark Fletcher, who received a frantic call from a terrified friend. Evelyn let the silence hang in the air for a moment before she responded. Mr. Fletcher, she said, turning her cool gaze on him, could you please recount for us the details of that phone call? Mark swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He glanced at Leo, who gave him a barely perceptible nod. Yes, Mark began, his voice cracking. Leo called me. He sounded terrified. He said Megan was screaming, that he could hear things breaking in the background. He was reciting the script just as he'd been told. He could hear things breaking, Evelyn repeated softly. And what did you say to him? I just told him to be safe. To call the police if he had to, Mark stammered. Evelyn leaned forward, her expression turning from curious to sharp. Is that all you discussed? You didn't, for instance, discuss the barbecue you all attended a month prior. Mark's eyes widened in panic. The barbecue? No, why would we? And your friend, Leo, didn't instruct you to tell the police that you witnessed me throw a wine glass on that occasion? I asked, speaking for the first time. My voice was quiet but carried across the silent room. Mark looked at Leo, then back at me, then at his lawyer. He was completely flustered. No, of course not. So you're stating, for the record, that Leo did not coach you in any way on what to say to the authorities? Evelyn pressed, her voice like steel. That's correct, Peterson interjected smoothly. Any suggestion of coaching or conspiracy is a defamatory fantasy created by an unstable person. Evelyn smiled that thin, terrifying smile. Unstable, volatile, these are the words, are they not? The words Mr. Hale specifically instructed Mr. Fletcher to use. Leo shot up from his chair. This is harassment. We're not going to sit here and listen to these baseless accusations. Please sit down, Mr. Hale, Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a commanding whisper. Or this will get significantly more uncomfortable for you. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small digital audio player and a speaker. You see, we don't have to rely on anyone's memory of the conversation. Technology is a wonderful thing. She placed the speaker in the center of the table and pressed a button. And then Leo's voice filled the room. Cool, clear, and utterly damning. Listen to me very carefully. This is what you're going to tell them. You're going to say that after everyone left, she went ballistic, threw a wine glass. The key is to make her sound unpredictable. Volatile, that's the word you use. Volatile, can you remember that? The blood drained from Leo's face. He sank back into his chair as if his bones had dissolved. Peterson, his smug lawyer, stared at the speaker with his mouth agape, his face a mask of pure shock. But the most powerful reaction came from Mark. As the recording continued and he heard his own stammering, compliant voice agreeing to the lies, his face crumpled. He looked from the speaker to Leo, his expression one of dawning horror and betrayal. He wasn't just a witness to Leo's crime. He was a named co-conspirator. The recording played on to its devastating conclusion. Just stick to the script, Mark. I'll make it worth your while. When the audio clicked off, the silence in the room was deafening. It was. Over, every lie, every manipulation, had been laid bare in the sterile, air-conditioned quiet of that conference room. Leo just sat there, broken. He stared at the polished surface of the table, seeing not his reflection, but the ruins of his life. Then Mark did something I didn't expect. He slowly pushed his chair back, stood up, and looked directly at Leo. There were tears in his eyes, but his voice, when he spoke, was steady. You told me she was hurting you, Leo, he said, his voice shaking with a quiet rage. You told me you were scared. You used me. You used our entire friendship. He then turned to Evelyn. I will testify to all of this. I'll tell them everything. That was the final, triumphant moment. It wasn't just my victory. It was the moment the man he had manipulated finally broke free, reclaiming his own integrity in a stunning act of defiance. The conspiracy hadn't just been exposed, it had imploded from within. Leo hadn't just lost the house, he had lost everything. The aftermath was swift and brutal. With Mark's cooperation and the undeniable audio evidence, Leo's legal position crumbled into dust. His lawyer, Peterson, dropped him as a client within the hour, likely fearing the ethical and legal blowback from being associated with such blatant fraud. Facing potential criminal charges for filing a false police report and conspiracy, Leo had no choice but to surrender completely. Evelyn Reed was merciless in drafting the settlement agreement. I received the house, free and clear, with Leo's name stricken from any and all documents. He was also required to reimburse me for my legal fees and the cost of the forensic accountant. He had to sign a non-disclosure agreement, legally gagging him from ever repeating his fabricated stories about my instability. The agreement effectively erased him from my life, leaving him with nothing but his mountain of debt and the scorched earth of his reputation. He moved out within a week. I didn't watch him go. I asked Jenna to be there to supervise, to ensure he took only his personal belongings. She told me later he looked like a ghost, a hollowed-out version of the confident man I once knew. He didn't speak a word, just packed his boxes in silence and left the keys on the counter. The moment he was gone, Jenna called me. "It's over, Meg," she said. "The house is yours." Walking back into my home that evening alone was a profound experience. It felt different, lighter. The oppressive weight of Leo's presence, which had lingered for years like a low-grade fever, was finally gone. I opened all the windows, letting the cool evening air sweep through the rooms, as if to cleanse the space of his memory. I walked through the living room and stood in the exact spot where he had made that fateful call to Mark. I looked at the smart speaker on the console table, a small, unassuming gray cylinder. It had been his tool of control, his symbol of a modern, efficient life. But in the end, it had been his undoing and my salvation. A few weeks later, I sat with Jenna on my back patio, sipping wine as the sun set. We talked about everything and nothing, the easy, comfortable conversation of true friendship. The trauma of that night had faded, replaced by a quiet, deep-seated sense of peace. "Have you heard anything about him?" Jenna asked gently. "Evelyn's office keeps tabs," I said, swirling the wine in my glass. "He's staying on his cousin's couch, the one he was supposedly staying with when he was at that hotel. Apparently, the story got out among their circle of friends. Mark made sure of it. Leo is a social pariah. His consulting business has completely dried up. No one wants to work with a man who would do something so monstrous to his own partner." There was no triumph in my voice, only a sense of finality. His downfall was the natural consequence of his own actions, a debt coming due. My focus was no longer on him, but on what was ahead for me. "What about you?" Jenna asked, her eyes warm. "How are you really?" I looked around at my garden, at the flowers I had planted, at the house I had reclaimed. "I feel clear," I said, and the word felt profoundly true. For years, I was living in a fog, constantly questioning my own perceptions, my own sanity. He made me feel like I was the problem, but the fog has lifted. I know who I am again. My work as a UX designer is about creating clarity and trust for users. It's about ensuring a system is intuitive, honest, and works for the person using it, not against them. Leo had built a system of lies around me, but I had used my skills to deconstruct it, to find the fatal flaw in his design. The experience had been harrowing, but it had given me an unshakable sense of my own strength and competence. The house was quiet now, but it was a peaceful quiet. It was the sound of solitude, not loneliness. It was the sound of a life being rebuilt on a foundation of truth, one that was entirely my own. The betrayal. Elle had been a fire that had burned my old life to the ground. But from those ashes, I was building something stronger, something better, something true. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely and utterly safe.